40 Waters, welcome back. New episode. So it's been a few weeks. Tried to figure out some things. I've got some new systems in place that hopefully things are going to be more consistent for the rest of season two. I sure appreciate your patience as we are working through this season. Really excited about some upcoming guests. I'm really excited about the guest today. First, I want to thank. Last month I got 3 brand new Patreon supporters, and I don't have your names in front of me. That is my fault, but I have messaged all of you. Thank you for your support. I really, really appreciate it. Helping make this podcast happen covers a lot of the overhead that this podcast cost me. So, in the meantime, this week I am talking to Trey with Retroactive Pedals. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. So we actually met last June, Summer NAMM, at Grant's house.
Yep.
Yeah.
Grant's
so
house,
Grant,
pizza party,
Big Ear
NAMM.
Pedals.
Yeah, Grant Big Ear Pedals, pizza party for Summer NAMM. I think that was, I think Winter NAMM had been canceled right before, right? And then,
Yeah.
so people kind of were coming out of their, hiding places for the Summer NAMM in Nashville. And Blake for the Tone Mob was also there, I think, right before that. And I think we did the Nashville episode for Tone Mob.
Oh
And
yeah, that's right.
yeah,
Because Blake wasn't there for Summer NAMM. He was there
exactly.
just because of String Joy.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that was really my first introduction to meeting a little bit more podcasting and YouTubers and stuff. I remember 60 Cycle Home, Ryan was there.
Mm-hmm.
Get Offset, Emily was there. You and some other people I've never met before. So it was, that was kind of really my first foray into kind of breaking outside of the circle of just pedal people, you know.
Yeah,
But
it's an interesting world. The entire gear world, the podcasters, the gear makers, the musicians. I've been really lucky to get a lot of musicians on here as well. But that was my first experience with your pedals, and so since then, I've been looking at the stuff you've been putting on Instagram, and Grant and I were just talking about it. He had me on his show, Talk About Pedals, his Instagram live show, and we were talking about your design aesthetic, and we're going to get there. I want to hold off before we get there. So
okay,
what I want to hear first is let's give your story so that listeners can get an idea of who you are, what you do. How'd you get into playing guitar? How'd you get into making pedals? The Reader's Digest version of your
sure.
story in the gear world.
Well, I'll start off as early as I can remember. So in fifth grade, I joined, or I tried out for a marching band, and I ended up being on the drum line. And the drum line is something that I've done for basically ever since until I graduated high school. So that was my first real introduction to actually playing music, being around music. As a drummer, we always play to a lot of metronomes for rehearsals and everything like that. And I really locked in a lot of things there as far as like musicianship to some degree. But I never really got behind a drum kit until, my early 20s. Um, and starting to listen to music and, going to college and making friends and everything, I joined a band and I was playing drums. I'm primarily a drummer. I should probably just say that straight away.
Sure.
Um, but it wasn't until I picked up a guitar in high school. I was probably like 17 or 18, and I picked up a guitar. And just through listening to a bunch of different types of music, you find your way of figuring out what your style is and how you want to play. And it wasn't until many years later, whenever I finally went to a studio and tried to record a song that I had written. At the time, I was pretty much using just reverb. I was kind of more. That's all I really had, a reverb and a phaser. I think at the time it was a EHX Cathedral and a MXR Phase 90. That's all I had.
Oh, nice.
And so I went to the studio and I recorded the song. And I think for like the chorus or whatever, the engineer Rick Nelson, who I'm sure we'll touch back on later on, he was like, "Hey man, this really needs like a gritty aspect to it." And I was like, "Okay, I'll give it a try." And he put on like a DoD fuzz of some sort. And I really was like, man, that really did add like a lot of cool grittiness to this very simple part. So that was my first real introduction to what pedals can do or what tone can do in the sense of, you know, adding dirt to your tone. And so I kind
Mm-hmm.
of went down the rabbit hole about that point. This was probably 2013, I think. where I started really researching forums and how to build a fuzz pedal. And and at the time I was also professionally working in music production and stuff like that, so I was already doing like a lot of just technical repairs and just technical gear setup. So I had that mind frame or that mindset of building and fixing things, or creating something. And that's kind of where it started. 2013 was the first time I really dove into buying parts and buying, doing a bunch of research and building my first fuzz pedal. So that's pretty much it.
Yeah, been doing it ever since.
Yeah.
So you're originally from Louisiana,
Hmm.
living in Nashville now.
Hmm.
How'd you get from Louisiana to Nashville?
Okay, so this story is very depressing for me.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's good though, and so basically up until this point, 2019, like I was touring professionally as a backline tech for a couple bands in town, or not in town, but just bands. Um, and I just come off of a really huge tour in 2019. I was like really, I was financially stable finally in a way that I'd never been before. And I had another opportunity right after that, like early 2020, to actually play drums for an artist that I've also toured with as a backline tech in the past before this. Like from 2014 to 2018, I worked with this artist as a lighting designer and a drum tech. And we became friends over the years. And this album cycle was a little lower budget. And, I think he pegged me because he can afford me, honestly. And I've never toured professionally as a drummer before, so it was a good fit. And he's a good friend, and I was happy to do it. So my landlord actually in New Orleans had to kick me out by like February 1st because they were renovating the house anyway. So they're like, hey, we're gonna make this way cooler and rent it for a lot more money, and we're kicking you out. So I put all my stuff in storage, and I was like, okay, this is fun and unique. I was like, I put all my stuff in storage. It's pretty scary. I don't have an apartment, but I'm gonna go on tour and play drums, and then when I'll come back, I'll sort it out. And I had already kind of had Nashville in the back of my mind because of the band I worked for in 2019. It was pretty Nashville based, and I met a lot of friends here. A lot of crew members were here, so I figured if I was gonna move anywhere after the tour, it would be Nashville because I have friends already, and then there's also obviously the music scene and the gear scene, and I figured it's just kind of I ran my course in New Orleans at the time, and so COVID happens obviously, and
Right.
all the tours were canceled, everything was canceled. I don't have an apartment, all my stuff's in storage, and I'm just staying at a friend's house to see if this all kind of blows over because people were saying that it would, in 2 months or whatever. And so the tour was still booked. It was still booked. It was still booked, and it just pushed so far back to where they finally were just canceled it all, and everything was just canceled. And so I was like, shit, man, like all my stuff's in storage. I can't stay at my friend's house forever. I was already staying there for like 2.5 months or something. And so I just moved. And then when I got here, I didn't work again for another 8 months. It was,
Oh wow.
yeah, that was a tough time being here and not able to really go out with friends or go out anywhere. And everybody was kind of hunkered down. And that was definitely a challenging time mentally for me, moving to a new place and feeling eager to go out and explore, but also can't. And then friends are
Right.
all over the place. And so that was pretty tough. But, you know, I've been living in Nashville now for about 2.5 years. And it's slowly getting better.
Yeah, and I actually really relate because where I live now, I moved here in February of 2020, and so had a good solid 6 weeks before the bottom fell out, so to speak,
Yeah.
of being able to meet people, being able to go do things. Um, so you're you're in Nashville now, which it's everyone. If you don't already know, I'm sure most of the listeners here they realize Nashville's more than a country town. Like I realize that country is like the big draw for Nashville,
Hmm.
but when I lived in Murfreesboro, the 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 other music that is in Nashville is incredible. There's if you think of the genre, there's representation in Nashville for it.
Yeah, I would agree.
Uh,
I don't. I mean, it is pretty wide ranging, I will say, but country still takes the cake.
oh yeah, it's that's obviously the driving force
Right.
for what's happening in Nashville. That's the biggest thing. Um, so you get to Nashville, you're living, so you're making these pedals now, and the thing that drew me to your pedals was you have like the coolest aesthetic to your pedals.
Mhm.
There's especially I think now it's even a little different than, and so it's been a while since I've seen one in person because I'm going based on a lot of pictures for some of this. Um, but like the color schemes, the artwork is incredible. The the um the actual texture of the tops is not just like painted metal. It's holographic, almost like that plushy. I don't know what to call that stuff. I
Yeah,
have no idea.
it's basically plastic. But
Yeah,
I actually don't know the actual material that it's made of. It's some kind of fancy word that they've written on there. But I'll say
sure.
it's I reached out to a company called Dome Tag out of Salt Lake City. Um,
Okay.
that's kind of how this whole thing started rolling. So for the longest time, I did all my own graphics, I did all my own artwork, I did all my own management of Instagram, and there was just there was a stalemate at some point. And I ended up reaching out to a friend who I reconnected with. Like we were friends back in early 20s when we played music together, and then I moved to New Orleans, and we just haven't spoken for a while. But then I saw he started doing a bunch of. He was running his own podcast. He was doing some like marketing materials for other people and companies. He was doing some graphic design work, and I reached out to him, and I was thinking to myself, this would be a perfect opportunity for me to just take that leap of faith and really invest in Retroactive and start paying somebody. And even though I don't really necessarily always have the money to do that,
Yeah.
I was like, and so I started collaborating with my friend Tyler Blanchard, who is responsible for all of the artwork that you see and all the graphic design, and now he's also managing the Instagram and all of my other social platforms. But yeah, the way it all started was I essentially just created a mood board on Pinterest, actually, just inspired by like my retroactive sort of, or my retro inspired movies like, Fifth Element, Blade Runner, Escape from New York, Demolition Man, just stuff like that that I watched as a kid growing up, that even though it's like futuristic, it's still old because it came out in like 82 or 80 or whatever. So it's like
Right.
there's this interesting cross between futurism and 80s retro kind of stuff, because that's when those movies came out. And so I just basically created this huge mood board, and I sent it over to him, and I was like, look, this is what I have to do to get my idea across. And I was like, kind of just come up with whatever you can in this realm, and he knocked it out of the park. And so going back to Dome Tag, I was kind of looking through some elements of faceplates. I didn't want to do uh, the normal plastic or metal with screws, or so I looked into it, and they usually make stickers for big brands, and I ordered a sample pack from them, and it looked cool. They had a bunch of different options, and whenever I saw the holographic, I mean, my mind started just going crazy. So I started working with my graphics guy, talking to the customer service person at Dome Tag, who was just incredible to work with, um, to making sure that, like, hey, if we leave out this area of the artwork, can we make sure that the holographic goes through, or if we cover it up with the layer and it's actually colored, what would that look like? And we talked it out for a long time, and they were also very, I guess, taken aback in a way, because they've never worked with the pedal company by any means. They just make circles or squares. They don't really make rectangles
Right.
with circles cut out in the middle. So it was a big process. I had to send them some prototype enclosures with like knobs and everything, so they can sort of make sure that they figured everything out. And it came out great. I'm really pleased. Like, very just over the moon about it. You know, Tyler did a great job, and it finally came together after seeing everything in the packaging and the pedals, and just seeing like what my vision for it ended up becoming. It just couldn't have been any better. So I
No,
appreciate you saying you like it. Yeah, thank you so much.
yeah, no, they're fantastic looking. And once you said Blade Runner, I totally got it. Like, oh, I get it now. Like, I didn't make that connection initially, but
Hmm.
the art, the feel is there. I get it. It's not like derivative or rip off, but it is like There's a feel
Yeah,
that you get when
exactly,
you watch the old, especially the old one, not so much the new one, the
exactly.
old Blade Runner.
Hmm.
Um, that you, it's that, and that's such a great way to look at it. It's like what the '80s thought the future would look like.
Right.
So the technology is old now.
Sure.
It's wild.
And even elements of like I threw in some like a little more comedic stuff like you remember the old Dick Tracy from back in the day, the kind of comic book
Yeah,
style Dick Tracy with the I was just incredibly enamored by the villains in that movie where they it was like a guy with a purple suit with a green face and a red hat. It was all very color, like massive color saturation. Dick
yeah.
Tracy and the artwork was like comic book style. And I'm not totally like crazy about comic books, but a couple of friends turned me on to this thing called Saga. I don't know if you ever heard of
Okay.
it. And
No.
I ended up buying all three novels, and like they're pretty big novels, and they're so creative and amazing. So I pulled a little bit of inspiration from Saga as well. But I wish I can say I was more of a comic book nerd. I like the approach and I like the way it looks, and I love the storyline elements
Hmm.
of comics. And I obviously grew up, being into like Batman and stuff in the early '90s or late '90s even. I'm probably gonna go see the new Batman tonight. Actually,
Yeah, I need
came
to
out
I need to
yesterday.
figure out when I'm going to go see that.
You
I've
know,
heard really really good things, and then I've heard a couple of mild criticisms. So I haven't heard anything just bad yet. So
right?
uh, this episode should come out. Batman would have released a couple of days when this episode came out. So maybe I've already seen it by the time this comes
Yeah,
out. We'll
yeah,
see.
same.
You definitely will have seen it.
It came out
Um,
yesterday, I believe. So,
yeah.
yeah, I probably will have
S-
seen it by the time this comes out.
So let's talk about the pedals that you do make. Right now, you
Hmm.
have four pedals listed on your website. One says
Right.
NOS. Does that mean you're not
So
actively building that one anymore?
it's just old style. I mean, that's the old diving bell pedal that I've made like whenever I was actually moving to Nashville.
Hmm.
It's bigger. It just has a couple more features on it that the new one doesn't have. I kind of ripped some stuff out that I wasn't totally pleased with overall at like when I started playing with it more and more. Because the whole point of doing the line in this aesthetic was to sort of merge everything into the 125p with the same exact knob layouts and the knob quantities and stuff like that to make everything just kind of super streamlined. So
Sure.
those are just some that I still have in stock that still look great and sound the same. There's just a couple more features in there that I ripped out for the new ones. So I kind of have them on there at a
Gotcha.
discounted price just to get them out of my hair and clear some space on the shelf. But yeah, the line is now just the three 125p looking ones.
Yeah, and it's worth noting. It's funny because I had Mike from Native Audio,
Mm-hmm.
Nate on the podcast a while back, and eh, like him, you don't have a traditional drive pedal in your current three pedal lineup. You've really leaned heavy on delay and ambient sounds and textures and stuff like that,
Right.
and you started out. We should get into this. You started out with honestly the harder side of pedals to get into. You didn't like release a three knob drive. You released things that required, you know, uh, programming, coding, working out of a pretty complex circuit. So what was that like to make that decision to put out, a more complex pedal as your first pedals?
Well, I will start off in saying that none of my pedals actually have DSP in them.
Oh, really?
I want to get into DSP, and that's kind of like a whole another story with me enrolling in Nashville Software School during the pandemic and in the data analytics program, and we did a lot of SQL, Python coding, and blah blah blah, which I think we talked about before, but I'll maybe get
We did.
to that later. My pedals, okay, to answer your question, I didn't want to go straight up with a drive or something because even though that's what I cut my teeth on because that's what I built
Yeah.
in learning how to solder, etc. Um, the market is obviously just saturated in general, but especially with overdrive and fuzz pedals. So I figured if I wanted to get anybody's attention, I really had to come up with something that was just unique enough or just a little wacky enough to where people would say, "Oh, that's something worth checking out." Maybe
Yeah.
So
It's different.
yeah, I mean, and I'll be the first to say, like the Dot Chaser is not some kind of revolutionary pedal. I mean, in the land of clones and stuff, it's like I'm enamored with especially in the DIY scene when I first started coming up. It's Mid-Fi Electronics and Doug Tuttle's music and his pedals. I mean, that guy is a super creative genius, almost in my opinion. I really looked up to him as a musician and a builder early on, and so the Dot Chaser is my homage essentially to his clarinet pedal, but I changed a lot of stuff on it. But when people on the forums or even in that book, The Pedal Crush or whatever, whenever they talk about the clarinet pedal and the Dot Chaser, they always kind of group them together because they're derivative of one another, or my pedal's a derivative of his pedal, you know.
Sure.
So that's what it is. I did a bunch of tweaks, and that pedal turned out to be something that for me, man, I use it all the time because it's just the right amount of grit. Because overdrive is my favorite effect too, you know, but it's just the right amount of grit that you need, and that's why I also love the PT chip, and that's kind of the other side of what I was going to say about. Even though my pedals aren't DSP as far as like me coding them or whatever, the PT chip is a digital chip because there is some analog to digital conversion in there.
Sure.
Also some storage of RAM and whatnot for the delays, not sound. So some people do say that's an analog chip, but it's really not. It just sounds analog, and that's why people use it, because I think it has some analog characteristics because it's so dirty and gritty, and it really breaks up towards the longer repeat times. But that's why I like it. I like stuff that sounds kind of bad. I'm not saying my pedals sound bad by any means, but you know, if you're putting it up to a pristine, you know, Strymon pedal or something, there's no way my pedal will do what Strymon pedal does. But my pedal definitely has its own use in certain types of music and certain applications that I've found to be really useful.
It's sort of like, in the way, at least the description, it's sort of like to hopefully not insult with a comparison.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of the same idea of the Caroline effects, the lo-fi reverbs and lo-fi delays that he puts out. It's meant to sound bad, but it's a good sound you want. Like, you want this lower fi sort of grittiness out of it. Because honestly, I think we're all a little tired of pristine. Pristine is kind of boring.
For me, it absolutely is. I mean, the type of music I play and the styles of music I play and my guitar style in general, it doesn't really warrant the use of, you know, a pristine reverb or a delay or something, you know. Even though I do have, well, I had one. I kind of recently just got rid of it. But I think the word lo-fi is used. I'm not going to say it's overused, but it's a good way for people to just throw in a word to sell something. You know, it's like, oh, this is lo-fi this or lo-fi that.
Right.
I'm not really sure if it's lo-fi necessarily. I definitely do call it that because the chip itself is a degrading chip, but that's why when I use it, I kind of push the limits of it to give it as much kind of grit and distortion as you can pull from the chip without overblowing it in a way that kind of does give you that degraded sound. I mean, it does have some sort of element of lo-fi to it, but I try not to throw around buzzwords as much as I can, just because nobody wants to hear that over and over again, just these buzzwords where it's like marketing and all this stuff. But sometimes you got to do it.
Yeah, sometimes you got to use the terms everybody's used to. I went on a not a big tirade, but I mentioned something in the Facebook group for the podcast, how I'm tired of hearing the phrase "plays like butter." That's disgusting. Please stop using that phrase. It's a terrible phrase.
Plays like butter.
Yeah,
I love butter.
Yeah, me too. I love butter too, but I don't want to hold it in my hands. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's a thing. But it's, you know, we hear all these words, lo-fi or bell-like, or what's another one? We won't even go down the transparent route when it comes to overdrives.
Right.
I've played one truly transparent overdrive in my entire life, and all of them do something. But so let's talk about the three pedals you do have, because so for the listeners that aren't already aware of your pedals, I think it's important we cover them because they are super interesting, and I'm going to end up getting one at some point, at least one, if not all three, you know, as finances allow. But we'll start with the Dot Chaser since you already mentioned it. It is and you mentioned the grit. It's a tape saturation, or at least the website says tape saturation emulator with
Mhm.
subtle to extreme modulation.
Mhm.
So it's the idea of getting that grittiness that you would get from a tape, because we were talking about not being perfect. I have a tape delay, and I love
Yeah.
that thing. I like it because it's not perfect. It
Mhm.
makes noise. It gets a little gritty. Sometimes I'm playing, and if I'm quiet, I hear the faintest sound of stuff that tape had recorded previously,
Right.
just out of nowhere. It's imperfect, and that is the fun part of it. So for those that don't have a tape delay or who aren't insane like me and don't want to keep the maintenance on a tape delay,
It's hard.
um, it's you add this in conjunction with a delay pedal. Suddenly you get some of those quirkiness, some of that. Um, I don't know. It's wild. I love those sounds, and you've got some clips on Instagram. Obviously, I've listened to. Um, so Um, that one we've already talked about, so I'm gonna pass back by that one. So we talked about the diving bell. That's the one that you have shrunk into the smaller enclosure now. You have the
Yeah.
new old stock on the website.
Yeah.
So delay echo with faux pitch bending. Talk about
Mhm.
the faux pitch bending.
So essentially, what's happening there is there's a momentary switch that when you press it down,
Hmm.
you are changing the delay speed instantaneously on a momentary switch. So as you know, as speed decreases or increases, so does the pitch in a way.
Yes.
So when you press the switch down, it does go down in pitch, but it also gives you kind of like this fake pitch bending. That's the only way I can really put it. Um,
Yeah.
and it
It's sort of the
you're
same sound as when you would play an analog delay and hold a note and just turn the time knob real fast.
Sure, but it doesn't do it in that cool ramping way. It's hard to like if you were to be playing and then turn the actual delay knob down, you'll have that kind of sound. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The like actual the switch doesn't really do that. It works in a different way that I can't really describe. It just instantly goes down to a set speed and then ramps back up to the speed it was at. However,
Okay.
there's like some kind of blooming, weird kind of notes, pitchy stuff that happens with it, which is cool because it doesn't affect your dry signal obviously at all. It's just part of your wet sound. So when you're playing your guitar, you'll always hear your dry, but there's always just these weird kind of notes that are fluttering around. And I will say, unfortunately, of all the demos that are out there, a lot of demoers will use a tabletop kind of performance where it's really hard to capture what that switch can actually do when you're strumming, and then as you're not playing, you're pressing the switch down and then releasing it and then strumming again. It really is like you kind of have to be playing and use your foot in a weird way to where you're kind of really getting that reaction out of it. Um, but it's super fun. It's super cool. I mean, it sounds great on synth loops and stuff, and you press it down, and it kind of has this. It just is a way to add a little flair to your sound. It's not just like a straight up delay pedal. That's what I try to do in a lot of my pedals is just throw one thing in there that's a little wacky to where it's not just a run of the mill. You name it. It's that was kind of the feature. And then going back to the new old stock thing, on the old one, I did try to put a volume swell in there. So there was another momentary switch where when you press it, your signal is essentially being grounded. And there was another pot on there that when you turn it, that's the regeneration of your sound.
Okay.
You can choose like how slow or how fast that sound gets regenerated in. And the more I played with it, the more I was just like, just use your guitar or use a volume pedal. It's better. So that's what I ripped out of this circuit. And whenever I put it in the 125B, I kind of was able to kind of cut down on parts and part of the circuit that I truly ended up hating. So
Sure. No, that makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's the thing about, especially in today's, like we talked about the saturated market, the pedal market is so incredibly saturated with everything. There's so
yeah,
much that unique feature of the momentary pitch shifting that hits with the time, or faux pitch bending. We'll call it
right,
faux. It's not truly bending the pitch.
exactly, exactly.
It's just messing with time. Um, that kind of feature, it's so cool because now, so let's look back and the music that was being created in like the 90s, right? Which is when I started playing guitar in the late 90s. really started to cut my teeth in the early 2000s. The music being made then, it was very much, even like the more creative guitar players in popular bands. Like I think about someone like Mike Einziger with Incubus, right? Or obviously we can talk about Radiohead and the stuff they were doing. The stuff they were doing was finding a way, in a lot of ways, using just regular stuff that was available in creative ways.
Right.
So where I'm going to try to find a great example. I think it was Greenwood with Radiohead was using the envelope filter, the DoD envelope filter, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it was. I don't think it was Ed O'Brien that was using it. I think it was Greenwood. Anyway, you could get the DoD and do that, or you could probably use any other envelope filter,
sure,
and get pretty close to that, right?
Right.
But now there's so many pedal companies carving out their niche and what they do, like what your diving bell does. There's not a lot of other pedals that could replicate that, right? Or do replicate that. Suddenly it's like, oh, this is the sound that of my guitar playing is this effect pedal.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's how I think that's the interesting thing is that's how people are starting to carve out their place in the pedal market. Is they're creating stuff that can be the defining feature of a guitar player's style.
I totally agree. I mean, the reason why I built the diving bell was because some of my pedals are obviously influenced by certain sounds that I'm inspired by or bands that I'm
Sure.
inspired by. I was going through a big Deer Hunter phase. I'm not sure if you're a Deer Hunter fan or ever heard of Deer Hunter.
I'm not a huge fan. I say I'm not a huge fan in that I haven't listened to a ton of their music. I'm aware of them.
Yeah, I went through a phase where I thought that they were just, they're extremely creative band, and a lot of their tones are really just incredible. The way they use certain sounds and just loops and or samples or whatever, and just the guitar style is simple, but it's always doing something that's filling the perfect gap. But I built that delay pedal, the Diamond Bell, basically around that sound where I wanted it to be as versatile as you could possibly make it. Where because I love slapback tones, like even the country chicken picking style sounds incredible, but I just don't use it that way because that's not my playing style and that's not the style of music I play. But if you use it in a different context, like this kind of like indie rock Deer Hunter element, it has its place and it sounds incredible. But I also had it to where it's almost like just it's not a reverb obviously, but if you turn the feedback up to just almost self oscillation and you get the mix just right, there's just this crazy oscillating looming echo that just hovers above your tone, and it never goes into oscillation, and it never just lives underneath where it's not always there. It's just a ominous sound, and you can use it for something way spacier, or you can turn the mix down and use it as that slapback sound. So I wanted something that was covering all of the spectrum, where you can do the slapback thing, super dry, super quick, or you can have this insane, just looming sound over your signal that never goes away. And it was incredible. I mean, whenever I built it and it worked, I was like, I can't believe it. It sounds good. But for like I do a lot of finger picking on acoustic, and even playing that on acoustic with that looming sound, it sounded great. You didn't need a reverb for it. It just kind of was there, and
Oh, that's a cool thing. I hadn't even thought about that with acoustic playing, just to give it like that fullness and that body and that extra, like, I don't know, it widens the depth of what you're doing a whole lot.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't have tap tempo, so you can't really do the U2 thing.
Yeah,
But
that's fine. There's a lot of people out there doing that.
I just that was the thing that I strayed away from using delay pedals for the longest time because my playing style just didn't warrant me using a delay that had such hard repeats and like very determined notes just trickling over my notes. Or I was so I always gravitated more towards the 30 millisecond thing and the kind of doubler effect and the slapback tones, or just crank the feedback and kind of use it as more of like an echo machine kind of thing.
Same here. That's why I use a tape delay. one, that's my favorite delay sound. I like that slight dirtiness, that little bit of warble. You know, depending on the age of the tape. The tape I've got in, it's too new. I'm waiting for it to get a little older, so I play it a lot. But
Right.
I like that little bit of texture that it adds, but I don't care about lining it up in time with the music I play because I don't play that music.
Exactly.
It's it's because I'm never going to crank the mix so high that it is the same volume as my initial guitar sound. And if you are, yeah, you might worry more about being in time, but it's always that subtle layer underneath my playing.
Of course.
Like even at its longest time, multiple repeats. It's a texture. It's not as much. You shouldn't be hearing it as a note. You should be hearing it as just a vibe or just an ambience underneath the playing.
I totally agree. One of my favorite things to do with a delay is, and you probably can't do this with many. I have a TC electronic flashback um, that I've been having for a long time. But one of the settings, if you turn the mix, I think it's the mix. It's definitely the delay time and the feedback down.
Hmm.
It's almost like it almost turns into a chorus pedal.
Yeah.
I just get a lot of versatility out of delays. And I have the Mag Echo by Keeley as well that has the modulation built into it as well.
Hmm.
Um, but just I love that sound, the doubling effect that old studio trick that people used to try to do with the doubling and all that. I just think that sounds incredible.
And it really adds something to the sound. It's okay, so it's weird the way in my head, like that sound, that doubling, like it feels like this makes no sense whatsoever. But it like I have a visual of what that sound looks like.
Hmm.
This is weird. I don't normally visualize things like this, but it's like if your amp were at the other end of a small concrete tunnel,
Hmm.
and that's what it feels like. That makes no sense. Physics don't work there. That's not how that works. But in my head, like I hear that sound and I feel like the amp is down a concrete tunnel somewhere.
Right.
And it's this cool thing. And if you're doubled the right way, it gives you just that little bit of extra push, especially in a solo section where you're a little more present in the mix without a lot more volume.
Right.
It's just such a cool thing. The My tape doesn't quite get slow enough to really get into chorus, but
Hmm.
I do like that. And of course, if you can get slow enough, you can get down into flanger territory as well. If
Right.
you can get not slow enough, fast enough, you can get that delay fast enough. Um, when I went to college for music and audio engineering, and in my audio engineering course, we had a fantastic professor named Mike Acapelli. He used to run front of house for Aretha Franklin. He's
Dang.
an electrical engineer, uh, organ player, keys player.
Sure.
But the first time he opened up a session in Pro Tools and showed us, okay, here's what happens. Here's what flanger and chorus are.
Hmm.
And he took a delayed signal and just started moving the delay around and showing us where those things happen and where it begins. And it blew my mind. It's all time based. It's all time. It's That's how you can do this. Um, and so it's really cool to be able to do that in a pedal. Do you know how fast your signal gets in that pedal?
No. I want to
That's
say
okay.
I do know that it's written down somewhere. The chip is only capable of so many milliseconds.
Gotcha.
Like in the quickest setting. Uh, it's pretty low, but it's not incredibly low. Like it's definitely not somewhere in the 30. So on a digital pedal,
Hmm.
I found that like 70 milliseconds is like where my sweet spot is for
Hmm.
that sound that I like. But Keeley makes the 30 millisecond one, and I think 30 is pretty damn low or pretty fast. You know what I mean for
Yeah,
a
that's
doubling
really
or a
fast.
chorusy sound or whatever. I don't. I honestly don't know what the PT chip is capable of doing at its minimal without the data sheet. But I did answer this question actually for a customer once. I just don't remember off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. No, I would have been surprised if you actually just knew off the top of your head. To be really honest,
Yeah,
and I
that
love
would have
what you said
sounded way
earlier.
cooler.
Yeah, I love what you said earlier about though when you put it together and you're like, and it worked, and I was surprised. It's sort of like as someone getting into computer programming, you'll understand. There's like a meme that goes around, and it's a guy, frustrated, looking at a computer screen, and he says, "My code doesn't work, and I don't know why." and then it's the same picture, and it says my code works, and I don't know why.
It's totally true.
That's totally true.
Yeah, yeah. For coding, absolutely. I mean, I did like I said, I was doing that 6 month course, and there was a lot of times where things did work, and I was just like, okay, whatever, it works. I'm just gonna go for it.
Yeah.
But with pedals, it's different. Pedals. There's definitely been a lot of times where I built something and it worked, and I wasn't understanding of the circuit 100%. But the more you build, and the more you read, and the more you research, and the more you read up on other things, it slowly starts to come together where you look at a schematic and you're like, okay. And it's the same thing with coding too. It's like I can look at a piece of code, like especially with my new job right now, the job that I just started 3 weeks ago. I look at this code and like I don't know what's actually happening. It's referencing databases and tables that I'm just not experienced enough with yet in the job. So I'm like, I know where I need to plug this in to make it work, but if I had to read this in a like in a one line kind of situation, it's hard to pick out what's actually happening. And it's the same thing when you look at a schematic. When I first started building, I was like, what the hell is this? I know what the symbols look like, and I know that means it's connecting here and here and here. But when you start doing some more research and reading, and you start building more and more, you're like, okay, this is the pull down resistor, this is the op amp for the input, or this is the buffer. These are the two things that make the gain happen. And when this is the tone section, or this is this, and the more you mess with it, the more it makes more sense. You know what I mean? So yeah, when I first built that pedal, that the delay was the biggest circuit I think I've taken on at the time. So whenever it worked, and especially because like my setup was still pretty small at the time too. So I had like the smallest breadboard cramming all this junk on there. And when it started working, I was just like I was amazed, because there's sometimes and every other builder will probably attest to the same thing. You're like, I'm just gonna build a LPB1 booster for fun today, and you're like, oh,
right.
You break out 8 breadboards for no reason, and you like build it and it doesn't work, and you're like, okay, am I just incompetent, or am I losing my mind here because I can't make this like one transistor boost pedal work? It's crazy how it works sometimes. And like so I buy a lot of breadboards. Sometimes like I'll use my multimeter and just some traces are broken all of a sudden, or so the breadboarding process is obviously, you just never know what you're gonna get. It's crazy. And so like even now, like I'll try to build something super simple, and something's weird, and I'll check my breadboard, and then like the next day I'll come back, try it again, and it just totally works. And it's probably user error, obviously, but that's why when I built the delay on the small breadboard early on, when it worked, I could not believe it.
Well, it's one of those things where it's really easy when you start. Every part you add exponentially raises the number of places you could have messed up.
Yeah.
It's like what is I'm going to call out Kyle, one of my patrons of the podcast. Decided to get an amp kit, and he didn't get an amp kit. He's actually an electrical engineer. I think that's right. I think that's technically his title, electrical engineer. He'll correct me if I'm wrong. He'll message me. It's fine. And he built the amp. He ordered the parts. He got the schematic because he can read, and he read schematics. He ordered all the parts, put it together, and then it didn't work. And he was like, "What the hell?" And so he looked at it, and he just put a resistor in backwards, just one, and suddenly flipped it, and it worked. It burnt one out, but once he got the right one,
because resistors don't have polarity, so he might have.
It may have been a capacitor.
Capacitor, probably.
Yeah, it might have been a capacitor. But he had one part flipped backwards, and it didn't work. And he messaged me. He's like, I have literally lectured classes on this,
right? And
then I did it. It's like,
sure,
you can be as good or professional or as
so easy to make mistakes.
Knowledgeable. So easy to make a simple mistake.
Yeah, extremely. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many times, when you're designing the circuit board itself, just something super simple like that, and it just sucks because obviously at that point it costs you money, But when money's on the line, I try to really hone in on concentration. But also just even without that, when you're first starting out and you learning a new program, you're learning a PCB design program, so you're bound to make mistakes. So I've made a ton, and I still do, but I've thankfully have been persistent enough to know where my mistakes have led me to check and make sure it's all correct. And so I've come a long way, man. It's insane. I actually looked the other day. I have a little storage bin of all these like random PCBs that still work, but I'm just not using them or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was actually, now that we're on the delay subject still, it was a PCB that I had designed the very first run, and this was before I was good at designing circuit boards, and the lines are just crazy. They're like zigzags and Z's and just like loops and all this stuff. And at the time, I was like, hell yeah, it works. So like whatever. And then I started seeing like real, excuse me, I started seeing like real gut shots of like really good pedals, and I was like, whoa. I was like, I can't sell pedals that look like this. If people open this up, they think I'm a crazy person. And so I really like I built a bunch of just random useless circuit boards like for myself just to practice my routing and practice. And now I know how to do it, and I know how to make them look nice. So all my stuff is thankfully like really nicely. All the traces are got the right angles and all the stuff. Not right angles for people who are judging, because you're not technically supposed to make a right angle on a PCB.
The correct angles.
The correct angles. I didn't want people to get confused.
Yeah, no, and that would be me. I would be the one getting confused, but
yeah, I'll send you a picture of it. Like I have one. I'll send you a picture of the first board I ever made. Hopefully, I think I have one lying around that still doesn't have parts on it, because without the parts, you can really see how crappy it was.
Yeah, you can see how it just looks like a bad maze.
And and something like that is also what really because like people are like, oh, PCB design, things have to be just right, or you can't do the right angles, and your capacitors have to be as close to the chips as possible. Man, like the pedal that I built that was wired or that was routed just like a crazy person did it, and the one that I have now that I'm extremely proud of and has surface mount parts and everything's like, they sound exactly the same.
Yeah.
They sound the same. So that's why I've learned to not really be that much of a purist when it comes to just gear in general or tone or whatever. I'm like, it's like what you said with the DoD thing, like with the envelope filter. And that's half the reason why I don't have like a crazy bunch of expensive pedals, because I can get close enough to satiate my need to continue to just create, instead of sitting there on the floor for 40 minutes trying to tweak my tone or whatever. I'm like, okay, this is what I have in my mind. This is definitely close enough. Right. Let's record it and just move on, and that's kind of the approach I take for a lot of stuff in general. It's just, I try not to be a perfectionist, or I try not to be a purist about stuff, just because it takes away from the fun of wanting to just take on what you wanted to do to begin with. You know what I mean?
That's ultimately why I moved away from things like, because I used for a little while a Helix rig, and I used it for some gigs, especially like musicals and other stuff. And my podcast listeners have heard me talk enough about church and musical and show choir gigs and stuff like that.
Sure.
But the thing I don't like about it is it's made for those people that really want to do that and like really replicate the sound of this record, or replicate this tone of this guitar player. And I've always been a big, like, the way I play, I want to capture the vibe. If I'm doing a cover, which a lot of my gigs are covers, that's fine. I'm primarily a blues player, but that doesn't mean that's the only thing I play or the only thing I know how to play. I've played in a lot of, function bands and wedding bands and stuff like that. I don't bother trying to replicate perfectly that sound. Get the vibe and enjoy doing it. And if you're playing and let's say you're close to that tone, but it's not fun or it's not hitting, and you decide to do it completely differently,
right.
add a flanger on this part that never had a flanger, or do just something different, I can do it. I can reach down to my pedal board, turn a knob, kick it on, and
right.
I'm going. I don't like the idea of, if I get a wild hair at a gig, I've got to go through 3 menus to change the setting.
Sure.
And that's why I like pedals and I like real amps, because I'm not a perfectionist like that. I do have a lot of pedals, not a lot compared to some people. And I don't mean just Josh Scott. I mean just in general.
Yeah,
but
that's his.
Yeah, he's ridiculous.
Honestly, it would stress me out to have that many pedals. I know for him it makes sense because he's a collector and like a historian, and like
right.
it's like a museum that he essentially has.
Yeah,
For me,
absolutely.
like for me, I just get I don't have. I mean, I have a lot of pedals, but I don't have like an absurd amount. But I flip a lot of pedals, or just like sell a bunch of pedals to get something that I'm interested in, or trying something new, because it just stresses me out if I see a bunch of gear on my shelf that's never being used, and I just feel like such a waster. And I just it just kind of stresses me out to have too many pedals that I'm not using at all.
Yeah, I've had friends who um get on to me about the gear flipping that I do and going through a lot of gear because I do. I go through a lot of gear. Always have.
Hmm. Yeah,
Ever since I started playing guitar, but that's because I want to try everything, but I
same,
can't afford to have everything at the same time.
same.
So, unfortunately, like the shelf behind me, how do I point? Okay. A
Yeah.
lot of that stuff is like pedals by friends of mine at this point. You know what I mean? And it's like
Is that a mini gong?
that is a mini gong. I've
I
had
can't see that.
yeah,
That's
what
cool.
I got that. So I was in the mid 2000s. I was dating this girl who really wanted a hermit crab, and so
Wow.
we went to this shop in I can't remember where we were,
Was
Tupelo,
it called
Mrs.
was it called Gumballs by any chance?
I do not
It,
remember.
there was a shop in my. It was kind of like a Spencer's back in the day. It was a shop in my local mall, like in the early 2000s, called Gumballs, and they sold like blacklight posters and a bunch of like blacklight stuff and hermit crabs. It was the weirdest
This
thing.
it might have been, but this was in either Tupelo or Oxford, Mississippi, I think. Um, but so we went probably Tupelo, and probably the mall. So yeah, it might have been the same type store or same
Yeah.
exact store, just a chain. But we went in and they had this like weird deal where like you get a hermit crab, excuse me, an enclosure and like some other stuff, and then you get like $15 credit in the store for something else, right?
It's insane.
And I was
It's
like,
probably the same thing. Yeah.
yeah, I don't see it. I didn't see anything I wanted. Like I was like, oh, there's a gong. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it, but okay, let's get the
Wow.
gong. Don't
That's so cool.
ended up still not still with the girl. The
Yeah.
hermit crab died, but I've still got the gong.
Right.
So
Yeah, that was the same thing for me. That store was like that was the cool place to go and kind of browse. We still never like I was so young that we didn't really have money to spend on stuff, but
yeah.
it was the same thing. It's like you either bought a hermit crab, you bought a blacklight poster, a lava lamp, or a Dunkin' yo-yo. That's like the four things
Okay,
that
this
people
is
went there.
absolutely the same store because all of
It
those
has to
things
be.
were in the store.
Yeah, it has to be. That's cool because I try to talk to people about gumballs and nobody knows what I'm talking about.
yeah.
And I was like, I was like, there's no way the little town that I grew up in has like its own crazy, cool store that nobody's ever heard of. It has to be a regional chain of some sort.
Yeah. That is wild. I haven't thought about that story in forever.
Yeah,
It's just traveled with me. I've had it
it's
15
cool.
years now. So it's like,
So does it come with its own little
oh yeah,
mallet, I guess, or whatever?
you can't really see it, but just underneath
Mm.
it on the stand is the mallet
Wow.
crossbar.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. So
That's interesting.
that's really hard to point behind me in mirror image. I'm not good at
Yeah, because
this.
this is reversed. No,
Yeah. Well,
I
it's the
got it.
right way for me, but it feels mirror image when I do this. It's
Yeah, yeah.
I don't
It's a little
understand
hard.
video. I'm still not good at this video thing. Yeah, it's wild. So I want to make sure we cover in the regular episode all three of your
Hmm.
pedals because I think they're
Okay.
all talking to us. So let's talk about the validity sensor, which
All
I'm
right.
just going to read the text on the website. Digital reverb with frequency divider LFO. Please
Hmm.
explain.
So another beautiful thing about the so here's something that most people probably don't know. The Belton reverb brick is what I use in there,
Mhm.
but that is so when people talk about the PT2399 chip, which we've talked about the other two pedals,
Yeah.
the Belton reverb brick is essentially three of those PT chips in I think it's in series actually. I could be wrong about that, but there is three PT chips in the Belton brick,
Okay.
and they make the reverb through the PTs, and that was actually designed, if I'm not mistaken, by Brian Neuneber. He's the guy who
Oh.
designed that. Yeah, he's the guy who designed the Belton chip.
Oh,
So
cool. Didn't know that.
yeah, and that's why the Belton brick is a digital reverb, as I mentioned before. The PT is a digital chip, so people do get those a little confused. I built the reverb initially in that kind of bigger enclosure that you saw on the website still with the NOS dot chaser, or the Diamond Bell rather. It's a little bigger. 1790 NS is technically the model. Um, And it was cool. I had a low pass filter in there because I wanted to do some kind of Radiohead stuff with reverb, so you can play some reverb and hit a low pass filter and kind of have this like underwater sound, and then you can kind of bring it back in. I also had a dampening bypass momentary switch that I took out. So there's a dampening control, but if you hit the momentary switch, you would obviously bypass the whole dampening system. So the
Gotcha.
digital reverb was just completely wide open and just it kind of had like a modulation element to it. And then I came across this circuit from this really creative guy on the internet called Raw Labs, WRAA Labs. And at the time, I was doing a bunch of research on like CMOS chips because there's a bunch of different stuff you can do with them. And I have a bunch of them that I was just like, what am I going to do with all of these? And I came across this one chip that is basically what the Lfo Frequency Divider is, where you send the signal into the chip, and then out of the chip it spits different ratios of the division of the pitch frequency LFO thing. So out of the chip comes in LFO, but based on the pitch or the frequency of the note you play, there's a ratio at which the LFO speed is relevant. So like if you hit a high E up on the neck, the LFO will go really fast because your frequency is really high. Whereas if you hit like a super low D or something like up on the lower end of the neck, the LFO is actually a lot slower because of that frequency response. And within that chip, there's like a bunch of different divisions. I just only picked the 4 most relevant ones that sounded the best. I think there's like six or 8 that you can choose, but I've only picked the 4 that sound the best. So you have within each division, you have that kind of frequency response. So when you mix it up with the reverb and use it, it kind of sounds like, I don't know if you know what granular reverb is or what people refer to as granular reverb, but if you turn the one all the way, if you turn the LFO to the highest setting where it's like super fast, it just sounds like a sputtery kind of glitchy reverb. But if you turn it kind of slow and then turn the modulation down, you kind of get that practical, slow moving amp style tremolo that I was kind of going for, where it's you can use it subtly, or again you can use it crazily. That's kind of like my thing.
Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. So that's a really wild, because when I read that description and as you're describing it, I had like 3 people pop into my head who need this reverb in their life. Like they're those people. One in particular is a reverb junkie. Joe, if you're listening to this, you need one of these. Just telling you. So, that's what I mean when I say like you didn't just put out a reverb pedal, a delay pedal, and a tape emulation pedal. You put out these really, really cool things that you built these interesting circuits around that I need to try. I need to try them out real bad.
I'll get you some for sure.
Well, yeah, definitely. We'll work something out because I've got to give them. I've got to get, especially because I've tried to be like the ambient reverb guy. Like I've done that a little bit, especially church gigs. They love that thing. It's weird.
I will say if you end up, we can work something out too. But if you do want to try some out, are you familiar with Main Stage Music there in like East Tennessee or like Chattanooga area? They have a full stock.
Do they really?
Yeah, and they're a super small company or a super small business, but they have a really cool and active YouTube channel. And check out their YouTube channel because I sent them all 3, and they did this really like interesting demo. And I was also kind of on the show, if you will. Talking about the pedals as well, so check that out. And
I'm gonna make a note to add that in the description below.
Their shipping would be pretty fast too, but also you and I can work something out. I mean, I can get you something easily and quickly.
I may have to also just because I may have to definitely the one I'm actually thinking about ordering from you is that NOS, like because I like big inconvenient pedals, so that's just me.
Well, if you want the NOS one, I would send it to you. No problem. No, free of charge. Free. No, it's fine.
I'll find something to trade you. I've got a room full of stuff. We'll make a trade. We'll find something.
I love bartering, so yeah, I'll trade you something for sure. But yeah, those are I'll just give you one of those for sure.
Let's see. I'm gonna write down pedal demo because if I don't, I will forget to put this in the description below. So listeners and viewers, it's in the episode description or in the YouTube box down below that I don't even know what to call it, comments or description.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, we're going to get ready to head over to the Patreon episode where this is where I want to hear, we're going to talk about, because I'm really interested, because New Orleans is my favorite city. It is my favorite city in the U.S. I want to hear we're going to talk about New Orleans music scene. I want to talk about some of the road stories, because there's always good road stories for anyone who's been on the road, especially as a tech. When you're not the band, I actually feel like you have better stories than the band has. I've had a couple of techs on the podcast.
Cool. Yeah, it's
So,
actually, whenever you were talking about the DoD Incubus thing, that was actually the last band I toured with before I kind of retired from touring, if you will.
really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is super cool. I actually did not know that. So, yeah, we're going to definitely have a fun time talking about that.
Yeah. It's funny because it came full circle because Mike Trombley was actually at the Dayton, Ohio show that we played, and I didn't see until he posted a story about it. And I was like, shit, man, I wish I would have known you were here because we couldn't met each other for the first time. I met a lot of people on Instagram through the road, like a lot of pedal people.
Yeah.
But we can talk about that in the Patreon, who I've met and who I've gotten to hang out with.
Yeah. So
through
if you want to
touring.
hear stories like that, hop over to Patreon, support the podcast. $5 a month gets you all the bonus content. And yeah, so we're gonna take a quick little pause, and then we're gonna move over to the Patreon episode. Trey, thank you for coming on the regular
Thank you so
episode.
much.
Listeners, make sure you hit like, subscribe, all those, follow, rate, review. You know how to do this. Y'all aren't new to this. Do all the social media things. Go to the website, 40wattpodcast.com. That is 40. Those are numbers. I never actually explained that in the podcast before. It's the numbers, not the word. 40wattpodcast.com. But in the meantime, until next week, until we are back, hopefully we're back to regular schedule now. See y'all next week. Until next time, be good to yourselves, be kind to each other, and make some noise.